السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. On this part of the prophetic supplications of the du'as of the prophets, I wanted to focus on the du'a of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this du'a requires me to kind of go into a story of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a specific snippet on what was one of the most difficult days of the Prophet ﷺ's life. Now the Prophet ﷺ, this story takes place during the Battle of Uhud. And during the Battle of Uhud, one of the mushrikeen, one of the kuffar, dug a trench in the battlefield, a small little trench in the ground. And the purpose of that trench that he dug was so that the Prophet ﷺ would fall into it, and they would be able to kill him inside of it. Now, during the Battle of Uhud, when the battle really intensified and it got really ugly for the Muslimin at that moment, the Prophet ﷺ, while he was falling, sure enough, fell into that trench. Now, when he fell into that trench, that one of the kuffar, that man who had dug that trench in the first place, came and stood over him. And he started to hit him with his sword on his helmet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He hit the Prophet ﷺ on his helmet until the chainmail that was in the side of the helmet of the Prophet ﷺ dug into his cheeks. It dug into his cheeks, inside of his mouth, inside of his face. And the Prophet ﷺ began bleeding profusely. And at this time it was announced in the battlefield between people that the Prophet ﷺ had been killed. And the companions of the Prophet ﷺ rushed over to him. They rushed over to him to see him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to see if the news was true. And it wasn't. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not killed. But they saw him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, inside of that trench, inside of that hole in the ground, his face completely bloodied and this helmet stuck inside of his head. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah pushed aside the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, "Leave the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to me." He tried to remove the helmet and he wasn't able to. And then he grabbed the pieces of metal that were in the side of the Prophet ﷺ's cheeks with his teeth. And he started to pull out the pieces of metal with his teeth. Every time he would pull out a piece of metal from his teeth, with his teeth, a piece of his teeth would snap off. They would break off in his mouth. Until Abu Ubaidah was known as Al-Ahtham. Al-Ahtham is the one without teeth. From pulling out that metal, those shards of metal out of the cheeks of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ after that was able to take off his helmet. And the narrations say that his face was so bloody, they were not able to tell his eyes from his nose from his mouth. And the Prophet ﷺ began to wipe over his face. Wipe over his face to try to clear the blood out of his eyes. In that moment, he wiping his blood and looking around at the battlefield and the gruesome scene that was taking place around him, the Prophet ﷺ rose his hands up to make dua. Now his best friend and most loyal companion Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh, looked at the Prophet ﷺ and was terrified in that moment. He was terrified that the Prophet ﷺ was about to make dua against his own people. And the dua of a prophet is never not accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the Prophet ﷺ rose his hands and he said in his famous dua, Allahumma hdi qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun. O Allah, please guide my people, for they do not know. In his infinite mercy and the beauty of his soul, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in that moment where he was left bloodied and bruised and aching, the battle where he and the Muslims lost for the first time and the only time ever, where his spirit was feeling defeated and his body was filled with cuts and bruises and pain, he made dua for his people, not against them. Showing us what the example of the ultimate mercy of a human being is like. O Allah, guide my people, for they do not know. O Allah, guide my people, for they do not know. How many times do we see somebody doing something in our day-to-day lives, or even on a wide-scale basis, where we say, man, that guy really doesn't know what he's doing. Going so far as to insult them or to call them names. Going so far as to speak poorly about them and to mistreat them, both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. But in his ultimate example, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he chose that moment to make dua for those people, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide them to the right path, for He Azza wa Jal in His ultimate mercy to bring them over to the right religion. And those same leaders that fought in that battle against the Prophet ﷺ soon became people that were Muslims under the Prophet ﷺ. And rather than fighting against Islam, they fought with Islam and the Muslimin. The power of the Duaa of the chosen one ﷺ, and the example of ultimate mercy between people. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us more patient and more merciful, and for He Azza wa Jal to have more mercy on us, and for Him to grant us the reward of this blessed month, and for Him Azza wa Jal to grant us the highest levels of Jannah altogether, inshaAllah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.